The courtroom was bustling with the usual rhythm of legal proceedings. Papers shuffled, murmurs echoed, and the clinking sound of gavel strikes signaled the end of each case. Judge William Harris, a man who had spent decades presiding over the municipal court, had seen it all. But today, something felt different. Anisha Carter stood at the front, waiting for the judge to address her. She was a striking figure, calm, composed, and radiating an almost serene confidence that contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere of the courtroom. Judge Harris studied her as she stood there. Her attire was professional, yet understated, with a grace that suggested someone used to commanding respect without asking for it. She didn't seem like a person who would be found in a courtroom over something trivial. Anisha's calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the usual defendants Harris saw, those who were nervous, defensive, or overwhelmed. The violation she was charged with was minor, something that could easily be overlooked by a judge who had seen hundreds of similar cases before. She had missed an appointment for a mandatory compliance check-in, a minor oversight that led to a fine, but nothing more. It was a simple mistake, one that could have been resolved without much fuss. Yet there she stood, quietly waiting, eyes focused ahead, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. Judge Harris cleared his throat and looked at the paperwork before him. It seemed straightforward, a minor violation, the paperwork in order. There was no reason to make a scene about it. He glanced back at Anisha. She was still standing there, patient, not fidgeting, not looking anxious as others in similar situations might. There was something about her that piqued his interest, something deeper than the typical courtroom interaction. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "you've been fined for not complying with the required check-in. I trust you understand the need for these procedures." Anisha nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand." The words were simple, but her tone carried a certain weight. Harris found himself pausing for a moment, an unusual hesitation creeping in. Normally, this was the part where he would move on quickly, but he found himself studying her. There was no defiance in her eyes, no sign of protest, yet the way she held herself made him feel as though there was something far greater at play here than just a missed appointment. "Very well," Judge Harris said, shaking his head slightly to shake off his momentary distraction. "The fine stands, then." He made a quick notation on the paper before him. Anisha didn't argue, but as she turned to leave the courtroom, Harris couldn't help but notice the quiet strength in her posture. For the first time in years, he felt the sense that he had just seen someone in this courtroom who had a bigger story than he could ever understand. But for now, he couldn't shake the feeling that this brief encounter might somehow change his own path in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The courtroom buzzed as the next case was called, but Judge Harris couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Anisha Carter, the way she had stood there, so composed, with a quiet power that seemed to draw attention without trying. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered someone who appeared calm in the face of legal proceedings, but something about Anisha had left a lingering impression. He had seen many people face consequences with varying degrees of anxiety, defiance, or indifference. But her response had been different, almost serene. As he shuffled through more paperwork, Harris found himself looking for her name on the next day's docket. He quickly brushed it off, irritated at himself for becoming so distracted. It was just a minor violation, he reminded himself. She had paid the fine and moved on, as everyone did. Yet he couldn't shake the thought of her. Who was she beyond the courtroom? What was the story behind that quiet strength? After the court session ended, Harris found himself wandering down the hall, thinking about his own life. He had spent decades in the judicial system, overseeing cases that were often more about procedure than people. He knew how the system worked. People came in, faced their consequences, and moved on. But something about this case felt different. It felt like he had encountered a glimpse of something larger, something he couldn't fully grasp in that moment. The next day, he decided to look up Anisha. His curiosity gnawed at him, compelling him to find out more. It wasn't like him to dwell on cases outside the courtroom, but this one felt different. She felt different. So he fired up his computer and typed her name into a search engine. What he found startled him. Anisha Carter wasn't just a random person who had made a mistake and found herself in his courtroom. In fact, she was far from it. Her name came up in several articles, public service initiatives, and even a few government newsletters. Anisha was a well-known advocate for equity in federal outreach programs. She had worked for years with various nonprofit organizations to streamline public service access for underserved communities. What struck him most was the way she was described. More than an activist, more than an advocate. She was a leader in transforming how the government engaged with its citizens, particularly those in marginalized communities. Harris sat back in his chair, the weight of his discovery settling over him. This woman, who had quietly accepted a fine in his courtroom, was making tangible, nationwide changes. She was someone whose work was already shaping the lives of many, even if his own understanding had been limited to a brief interaction in a courthouse. The quiet, composed woman who had just faced him was a key figure in a movement he had never even imagined. Suddenly, the fine seemed insignificant, a small detail in a much larger picture. The realization hit him hard. He had just met someone who was changing the very systems he had dedicated his career to upholding. The discovery about Anisha Carter left Judge Harris unsettled, but in an unexpected way. He had always considered himself aware of the social issues surrounding his work, but this was different. He had dismissed her, like so many others, as just another minor case in the endless procession of routine court appearances. Yet Anisha wasn't just any ordinary person. She was someone who had already begun making waves in areas he had never fully understood. After his initial search, Harris delved deeper. He found numerous articles and interviews, each one revealing another layer of Anisha's work. She was a force in the field of federal outreach programs, particularly when it came to increasing access for communities that often fell through the cracks of bureaucracy. She had worked with local governments and federal agencies to redesign systems that had historically been difficult for many to navigate. Anisha had spearheaded initiatives that were designed to make federal resources more accessible, especially for those who, because of their socioeconomic status, race, or location, had always struggled to receive equal opportunities. The more Harris read, the more he realized how little he had known about the real challenges facing people who relied on federal services. Anisha wasn't just about making sure people filled out forms correctly. Her work was about breaking down the barriers that made those forms so difficult in the first place. Her goal was to create an environment where people were empowered to access resources without feeling like they were at the mercy of a complex, impersonal system. In one article, Anisha described how she had worked with several governmental departments to streamline applications for housing assistance, ensuring that they were clear, efficient, and culturally competent. Another piece described her advocacy for expanding internet access to rural communities, ensuring that people in remote areas had the same opportunities to apply for government services as those living in urban centers. It was clear that Anisha wasn't just advocating for change. She was actively implementing it, bringing tangible solutions to life. What shocked Harris even more was that these efforts were having real-world effects. Programs that had once been inefficient and exclusionary were now more inclusive, with streamlined procedures and better outreach strategies. Anisha had helped launch a platform that connected people directly to available government resources, cutting down the wait time and bureaucracy that often left citizens feeling invisible. In reading her work, Harris began to question his own assumptions. He had spent so much of his career focused on the day-to-day legal cases before him, but he had rarely thought about how these larger systemic issues affected the people who came into his courtroom. His role had always been to enforce the law, but Anisha's efforts were showing him that the law itself needed to evolve, needed to become more accessible, fair, and open to everyone, especially those who had been historically underserved. The more he read, the more Harris realized how little he truly understood about the impact of his own profession on people's lives. And it made him wonder, what could he, in his position as a judge, due to be a part of the change that Anisha had already started. Judge Harris couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. As the days passed, his curiosity about Anisha Carter grew. He couldn't simply let her pass by as just another face in his courtroom, not after learning about her groundbreaking work. The case had been so trivial, but now it seemed like a mere blip in the larger story of her life. Harris began to feel a strange sense of urgency. He had to know more. One evening, he spent hours combing through articles, interviews, and even a few video clips of Anisha speaking at conferences. As he watched one particular speech, he was struck by her eloquence and passion. In front of a room full of policymakers and activists, Anisha had laid out a vision for a more equitable future, one where government resources were not just accessible to those with the right connections or the right education, but to anyone who needed them, regardless of their background. She spoke about how the federal systems, designed to help the disadvantaged, often became obstacles themselves. The red tape, the confusing jargon, the endless paperwork, it was a system built with good intentions, but riddled with inefficiencies that excluded far too many people. Anisha's solution wasn't just about simplifying forms. It was about rethinking how people interacted with those systems altogether. Harris was riveted as she described her efforts to break down these barriers. One project she had led involved creating a multilingual call center, allowing people from different cultural backgrounds to get assistance in their native languages, rather than being lost in translation. Another initiative had focused on making online services more accessible to those with disabilities, ensuring that technology didn't leave anyone behind. As he continued to watch, Harris found himself amazed by how proactive and forward-thinking Anisha's approach had been. Her work had already sparked major changes within federal outreach programs, and the results were undeniable. Her programs had helped thousands of families gain access to housing, healthcare, and educational resources that they had previously been denied. What's more, Anisha's work had garnered national attention, with leaders from both the private and public sectors praising her ability to build partnerships and drive systemic change. But what struck Harris most was the underlying theme that emerged from her work: empowerment. Anisha wasn't just creating systems that were easier to navigate. She was giving people the tools to help themselves. Her focus wasn't on charity. It was on creating lasting, sustainable change that would have an impact for generations to come. Harris leaned back in his chair, absorbing the magnitude of what he had just learned. The woman who had been found in his courtroom was a quiet revolutionary, changing lives in ways he had never even considered. His role, for all its importance, seemed small in comparison. He felt a stirring sense of responsibility. If Anisha could make such a difference, maybe he could too. Maybe, just maybe, there was more he could do within the confines of his own role as a judge. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He had only scratched the surface. Anisha wasn't just an advocate. She was a force of change, and her impact was far more significant than anything he could have imagined in that moment when he had handed her that fine. The more Judge Harris delved into Anisha Carter's work, the more he realized how limited his view had been of the broader system. He had spent years working within the confines of the law, delivering judgments and ensuring order in his courtroom, but it wasn't until he learned about Anisha's initiatives that he began to understand just how much more there was to justice than the black-and-white decisions he was accustomed to making. Her work had illuminated an entire world of inequities and inefficiencies that most people in his line of work never fully grasped. Anisha didn't just confront problems, she dismantled them, finding solutions that not only improved the system, but also gave people hope for a future where they were seen and heard. It was a level of systemic change that Harris hadn't considered, perhaps because he had always been so focused on the cases right in front of him. As he reflected on this, he couldn't help but think about how often he had seen people in his courtroom who were there because they felt the system had failed them. They weren't criminals. They were people who had fallen through the cracks, struggling to navigate a system that wasn't built with them in mind. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. What Anisha was doing on the outside was In many ways, the kind of reform that could actually change the lives of those who found themselves in his courtroom. Then, one evening, he watched another video of Anisha speaking at a national conference. This time, she was addressing a room full of lawmakers and government officials. Her words rang with urgency and clarity as she spoke about the need to restructure public programs to be more inclusive, transparent, and accessible. Harris found himself hanging on every word. Anisha wasn't simply talking about theoretical changes. She was outlining practical, actionable solutions. At one point, she said something that struck him deeply. Justice doesn't begin when someone steps into a courtroom. It begins when they are given the tools to succeed before they ever enter one. That statement stayed with him long after the video ended. Harris had spent his career believing that his job as a judge was the final step in ensuring justice for those who broke the law. But Anisha's words opened his eyes to something more profound. Justice wasn't just about making rulings after the fact. It was about preventing the need for those rulings in the first place. It was about addressing the underlying issues that cause people to stumble, to get caught in the system, to fall into a cycle that was difficult to escape. For the first time in a long while, Harris felt a sense of unease. He had spent so much of his career focused on maintaining order, on applying the law as it was written, but now he realized that the law was not always the answer. In fact, sometimes it was the problem. Anisha's work had shown him that true justice was about much more than a ruling. It was about creating a system that actually served people, all people, from the start. He knew, in that moment, that he couldn't keep operating as he always had. Something had to change. The question was, what could he do to help? Judge Harris couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities, about how his role as a judge could be more than just a mechanism for dispensing judgment. Anisha's work had revealed to him a broader landscape of justice, one that wasn't confined to the courtroom, but extended into the very fabric of society. Her ability to create lasting change in the lives of people who were too often ignored by the system inspired him. He was no longer content with simply presiding over cases. He wanted to be part of the change that Anisha had started. The idea of reaching out to her was not something Harris took lightly. As a judge, he had always maintained a professional distance from those outside the courtroom, particularly from those whose cases he might oversee. But something about Anisha's work, and her quiet, powerful presence in his courtroom, called him to break that mold. His curiosity, combined with a growing sense of responsibility, pushed him to act. After a few days of internal deliberation, Harris decided to write a letter. The formality of a letter seemed like the best way to approach someone of her caliber. He knew that reaching out could be seen as unusual, perhaps even intrusive. But he also knew that if he didn't, he might never have the chance to connect with someone who had such a profound influence on the issues that truly mattered. In his letter, Harris expressed his admiration for her work. He acknowledged his initial misjudgment of her, having seen her merely as a defendant in his courtroom. But after learning more about her contributions to federal outreach programs, he wrote, he realized that the true impact of her efforts went far beyond anything he could have imagined. He apologized for his brief, impersonal decision to fine her, recognizing that, in doing so, he had failed to acknowledge the depth of her influence and the systemic changes she was championing. He ended the letter by asking if she would be willing to meet with him, not only to discuss the finer points of her work, but also to explore whether they might collaborate on creating positive change together. Harris sat back after sending the letter, his mind swirling with questions. Would she respond? Would she be open to the idea of working with him? He had no way of knowing, but a small part of him hoped that she would. The days that followed were filled with a nervous anticipation that he hadn't felt in years. Finally, a reply arrived. Anisha had agreed to meet. The email was brief, yet it carried the weight of a significant turning point. Anisha thanked him for his letter and expressed interest in discussing his thoughts further. She proposed meeting at a community center where she often worked with local leaders. It seemed like a neutral ground, a place where the work could truly be about the issues, not about titles or roles. Harris read her response with a sense of relief and excitement. This was the beginning of something entirely new for him. An opportunity to learn, to grow, and to perhaps make a real impact outside the walls of his courtroom. He knew this meeting could be the first step toward a partnership that could change lives, and he was eager to see where it would lead. The meeting was set. Judge Harris felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as he walked into the community center where Anisha had asked to meet. It wasn't the typical setting he was used to, far removed from the sterile formality of his courtroom. The community center was vibrant, filled with the sounds of people working together on various initiatives. It was a place where action, not just conversation, took place, a place where change was already happening. As Harris walked through the doors, he was greeted by Anisha herself. She was exactly as he remembered, composed, calm, but with an intensity in her eyes that conveyed a sense of purpose. Anisha stood up from a table where a group of local leaders had been discussing projects and extended her hand with a warm, confident smile. "Judge Harris, I'm glad you could make it," she said, her voice carrying a friendly yet purposeful tone. There was no trace of the formality he had expected, just a genuine warmth that made him feel like he was walking into a space where everyone's contributions were equally valued. "Thank you for meeting with me, Miss Carter," he replied, shaking her hand. "I've been following your work, and I have to say, it's impressive. I didn't realize the depth of what you've been doing. My perspective has been somewhat limited, and after our brief encounter in court, I felt compelled to reach out. I believe there's much more I can learn from you." Anisha gestured for him to sit at the table. "We all have things to learn from each other. That's how real change happens, right? When we're open to different perspectives and willing to collaborate." Harris sat down, feeling more at ease as the conversation began. They started by discussing the specifics of Anisha's work, how she had worked to streamline government processes, advocate for underrepresented communities, and develop new outreach methods that had changed the way federal programs engaged with citizens. But as the conversation deepened, Harris began to see how Anisha's approach wasn't just about fixing broken systems. It was about creating systems that could prevent people from needing to rely on those broken systems in the first place. "I've spent most of my career administering consequences for those who slip through the cracks," Harris confessed. "But what you're doing, what you're changing, is about keeping people from falling through those cracks in the first place. I realize now how much more can be done before people ever step into a courtroom." Anisha nodded. "Exactly. We have to look at the root causes of the issues people face: poverty, lack of education, inadequate access to services. It's about building bridges, not just handing down judgments." The discussion was fluid and eye-opening. Harris could sense the passion that drove Anisha, but what truly struck him was how grounded and practical her solutions were. She wasn't merely theorizing. She was putting real, actionable strategies into place. As the meeting continued, they began discussing ways that Harris could become involved in her initiatives. His legal expertise could offer a unique perspective, particularly when it came to reforming policies that had long been entrenched in bureaucracy. It wasn't long before Harris realized that his role as a judge could be a tool for systemic change, not just an isolated function within the court. By the time the meeting ended, Harris felt like a new chapter was unfolding for him. One where the law wasn't just about enforcing rules, but about using his position to create lasting, meaningful change. As he stood up to leave, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. He had been introduced to a world of possibility he hadn't known existed, and for the first time in years, he felt invigorated by the work ahead. Anisha had given him the chance to be a part of something far greater than he ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, Judge Harris immersed himself in the world that Anisha had introduced him to. The more he worked alongside her, the more he realized how much potential there was for meaningful reform. His experience in the courtroom, his understanding of the law, and his deep awareness of its flaws made him uniquely positioned to help drive change, but only if he was willing to embrace a new way of thinking, a new way of serving justice. Anisha had invited Harris to several community meetings where he was introduced to leaders from various sectors. activists, policymakers, and community advocates who were all working toward the same goal, creating a system that worked for everyone, not just a select few. It was in these settings that Harris began to see how justice could be something that people felt a part of, rather than something imposed upon them from above. The meetings were full of action, brainstorming, and collaboration, and Harris found himself contributing ideas he had never considered before. One of the first projects he joined was a legal clinic that offered pro bono services to underserved communities, helping individuals navigate legal processes that had once been nearly impossible for them to understand. Harris, with his extensive knowledge of the legal system, was able to offer guidance and counsel, but more importantly, he was able to see the challenges people faced in real time. These were individuals who had fallen through the cracks, people who had been punished not because they were bad, but because the system they had been caught in wasn't built for their success. As Harris began to work more directly with Anisha, he noticed how she didn't just advocate for change, she embodied it. Whether she was negotiating with government agencies or working with local grassroots organizations, she had a rare ability to bridge gaps and create connections that made her a true catalyst for systemic transformation. And with every meeting, every conversation, Harris felt more inspired to follow her lead. Together, they worked on refining government programs, making them more accessible to people who had historically been excluded. Anisha taught him the power of collaboration, of bringing together people from different walks of life to solve complex issues. She showed him that while laws were important, they were only part of the equation. Real justice, she believed, came from ensuring that people had the resources and opportunities to thrive before they ever found themselves in a courtroom. Over time, Harris began to see the tangible effects of their work. People who had once struggled with accessing benefits now had clearer pathways to assistance. Community members who had once felt powerless in the face of government bureaucracy were now empowered to advocate for themselves. And through it all, Harris found himself becoming more than just a judge. He was becoming an advocate for systemic change. One afternoon, as Harris reflected on the journey he had taken, from the day he had imposed that fine on Anisha to the work they were now doing together, he realized just how much he had changed. The fine he had given her seemed like a distant memory now, eclipsed by the much larger impact they were making in the world. And as he looked ahead, he knew that the road ahead would be long, but it was one that was worth walking together. Anisha had opened his eyes to a world of possibilities, and for the first time in his career, Harris felt truly hopeful about the future.